The laugh struck her before the music did. It came sharp and bright under the chandeliers, like glass breaking where no glass had fallen, and Eleanor Hart knew at once that it was for her. She was standing near the long table of cakes and silver cups, trying to tuck the torn seam of her glove beneath her wrist, when one of the ladies lifted a brow and smiled at the others. "Oh, look," she said softly, though not softly enough. The poor thing's glove gave up before any gentleman had to. Even Rose let out a startled laugh. Lydia pressed her lips, then failed to stop her own. Eleanor felt every candle in the room turn toward her. Then the music changed, and across that wide golden floor, the Duke left the pretty sisters where they stood, came straight to the girl being laughed at, and said, in a voice so calm it hurt, "Miss Hart, will you dance with me?" That morning had begun in rain. It tapped at the windows of Hart House with thin, cold fingers, and ran down the old stone like tears that no one had time to wipe away. The house had once been warm and easy. Eleanor still remembered that. She remembered her father laughing in the hall, with mud on his boots, her mother, with softer eyes, Rose singing badly at the piano, Lydia chasing a ribbon down the stairs. But her father had been dead for 3 years now, and grief had not been the only thing he left behind. He had left debts, he had left broken fences, thin fields, and a roof that leaked over the west room. He had left a name that sounded grand to strangers, and meant very little to the butcher, the baker, and the men waiting to be paid. So Eleanor kept the books. She sat in her father's old study with her sleeves rolled, the cuffs of her plain blue dress brushed with dust, and her fingers marked with ink where the pen had slipped. She knew which tenant had lost a cow, which wall would not stand another winter, which bill her mother had hidden in the drawer beneath the tea-cloth, because looking at it made her hands shake. No one had asked Eleanor to learn these things. She had only seen, little by little, that someone had to carry what the house could no longer carry by itself. She had grown used to silence. She had grown used to being useful. Her sisters had grown used to other things. Rose, the eldest, had hair like dark honey and a face people remembered after one look. Lydia, younger by a year, had bright eyes, quick laughter, and the kind of beauty that seemed to glow brighter whenever anyone watched. Their mother had trained them for rooms like the one waiting that night. She had taught them which colors made skin look soft, how long a smile should rest on a man before moving away, how to lower their eyes without seeming weak. It was not because she was cruel by nature. Fear had made her sharp, fear of losing the house, fear of watching one daughter after another slip into a life of poor rooms and colder meals, fear of growing old with nothing left to trade except hope. Eleanor was not part of that trade. It was not that she was ugly. No one ever said that. They simply said nothing at all. Her face was too quiet. Her mouth did not flirt. Her eyes did not sparkle on command. She looked, people said, sensible. It was the sort of word used when beauty had passed by and politeness stayed behind to bow. Eleanor had long ago made a strange peace with it. In some dark corner of her heart, she had learned that her family spent their best fabric on Rose and Lydia, because that was where the world promised its highest price. She did not blame them every hour for it, only some hours, the worst ones. When the invitation came from Blackthorn Hall for the Duke's winter ball, her mother held the thick cream card as if it were a hand reaching out of deep water. "All 3 girls are named," she said. Rose gave a pleased little breath. Lydia clapped once and then tried to pretend she had not. Eleanor looked up from the account book and said nothing. Mrs. Hart's eyes moved to her. "You will come as well." "There is no need," Eleanor answered. "You would do better to save the cost of another hem." Her mother's mouth tightened. "Do not be dull. A family with 3 daughters looks stronger than a family with 2. And if His Grace invites the county, we do not insult him by leaving one child behind like a servant." The words stung because they were meant not to. That was how it often was in their house now. Kindness, when it came, was dressed so badly that it felt almost like blame. Rose turned toward the fire and smoothed her skirt. "No one will look at numbers tonight, Ellie. Try not to wear that face." "What face is that?" Eleanor asked. "The one that tells the room you would rather be somewhere else. I would rather be somewhere else." Lydia laughed. At least she is honest. They all laughed then, even their mother, though softly. Eleanor bent her head back over the book, but she smiled, because sometimes the only way to keep peace in a tired house was to pretend the little cuts were only light touches. That afternoon, when the gowns were laid out on beds and chairs, Eleanor opened the carved box that had once belonged to her mother before marriage had made her practical and years had made her hard. Inside, beneath a fan with a broken rib and a ribbon gone pale with time, lay a pair of dove-grey gloves. Eleanor had mended one of them last spring when she found the seam split at the wrist. The stitches were small and neat. She had made them almost invisible. Her mother saw the gloves in her hands and paused in the doorway. "I wore those at my first London supper," she said. Eleanor looked up. "May I?" Mrs. Hart nodded after a moment. "Yes, though they are old." "So am I," Eleanor said, and for one brief second her mother's face almost softened into the woman she had once been. "Do not say such things at 22, she murmured. Then she turned away before the softness could settle. At dusk, the carriage took them over wet roads toward Blackthorn Hall. Lanterns glowed through the rain. Rose and Lydia sat opposite Eleanor, bright in satin, warm from excitement. Eleanor wore a pale gown remade from one of her mother's old dresses. It fit well enough, though the lace at the cuffs had yellowed a little. The grey gloves lay smooth over her hands, hiding the ink stains beneath. She looked at them and thought of all the women who had once hoped in gloves like these. How many had gone home chosen? How many had gone home smiling? How many had learned that silk and candlelight could make a promise they did not mean? The Duke's name had lived in the county for years like a closed gate. Henry Ashcombe, Duke of Blackthorn, had inherited too young, after a father who was obeyed more than loved, and a mother who had not lasted long in the great house. People said he was proud. People said he was cold. People said he watched too much and spoke too little. He was rich, unmarried, and old enough now that every mother with a daughter turned a little brighter when his carriage passed. Yet he was known for one thing above all. He did not dance unless duty forced him. Eleanor had never cared much about that. A man's distance was his own affair. Still, as the carriage rolled beneath the arch, and the house rose before them in a sea of light, she felt a strange tightness low in her chest. Blackthorn Hall seemed built of winter and gold. Its windows burned against the dark. Footmen moved under the broad front steps like shadows in blue and silver. Inside, the air held candle smoke, beeswax, wet wool, perfume, and the faint, sweet smell of oranges from the supper room. Music floated from farther in, satin brushed marble, laughter slipped over the walls. Everything shone. Rose and Lydia belonged there at once. That was the cruel thing. They stepped into that bright world as if they had been missing from it all their lives, and had merely come back to claim their place. Men bowed. Old ladies smiled. Two young officers nearly turned their heads off their necks, watching Lydia cross the room. Eleanor followed with her mother, and felt herself become what she always became in crowded rooms. A chair no one sat in, a painting no one truly saw. At first she did not mind. She was used to standing at the edge. She watched Rose begin a set with a baronet's son. She watched Lydia gather a ring of laughing young men as easily as a lamp draws moths. She fetched her mother tea. She spoke kindly to a widowed neighbor. She stood near the great mirror and thought that perhaps the night might pass with no hurt done if she simply made herself small enough. Then Lydia came flying toward her in a rush of pink silk. "Do not stand like that," she whispered. "You look like a governess at a funeral. I am only standing, yes, and badly." Rose joined them, cheeks warm from dancing. "Lord Penford asked if you were our cousin." Eleanor almost smiled. "Did you tell him I was the maid?" Rose gave a breath that should have been a laugh and looked away too fast. That was when Eleanor knew the answer. A hot sting went through her, not large enough for tears, only large enough to make her hands feel suddenly empty. Lydia saw it and began to speak, then stopped. She looked ashamed for all of 1 second, but shame in bright rooms is a weak thing. It rarely lasts when eyes are watching. A group of ladies drew near. One of them asked Rose with a sweet false look if all 3 sisters intended to hunt the same duke. Rose said something quick. Lydia added something lighter. The ladies laughed. Eleanor tried to step back. At that same moment, a passing gentleman brushed the table beside her. A cup tipped, and cold punch splashed across the front of her pale dress. She caught the edge of the table with one hand. The seam of her old glove gave way. There it was. Grey silk opened at her wrist. Her own skin showed through, and the ink stain near her thumb like proof that she belonged to work, not to music. "Oh, look," said one lady, smiling. The poor thing's glove gave up before any gentleman had to. Lydia sucked in a breath. Rose made a sharp little sound that turned to Eleanor's pain into laughter. Not because she found it kind, not because she wished it, because fear had taught Rose to laugh first, or be laughed at next. That was the law of rooms like this. Lydia laughed a beat later, frightened and bright, because Lydia had always learned to throw her voice toward danger, as if it were a stone and not a cry. Eleanor felt the room tilt, not enough to fall, only enough to make standing a labor. Then the music paused. Silence moved like a cool hand over the nearest circle of people. Someone bowed. Someone whispered, "Your Grace." Henry Ashcombe stood a few feet away. He was taller than she had thought, dressed in black and white so plain. It looked severe beside the silver and blue of the room. He was not handsome in the soft way painters liked. His face was cut in cleaner lines, hard brow, straight nose. Mouth too restrained to be easy, but his eyes were not cold at all. They were watchful, dark, and far more tired than a man of his years should have looked. He glanced once at Rose and Lydia. They straightened at once, both lovely, both waiting. Then his gaze moved to Eleanor's split glove, the stain on her dress, the way she was holding her breath so no one would see it shake. He did not ask what had happened. He did not give the room the gift of making her pain a story. He only held out his hand. "Miss Hart, will you dance with me?" For a second she could not move. Rose went pale. Lydia blinked hard. The ladies who had laughed lost the easy shape of their mouths. Eleanor heard herself answer, "My glove is torn, Your Grace." His hand did not lower. "I asked for your dance, not your glove." A few people smiled at that, but the smile did not feel cruel. It felt like air returning to a room that had forgotten how to breathe. Eleanor placed her hand in his. Even through silk, she felt the warmth of him. He led her onto the floor as if there had never been any other plan. The music began again. Couples formed around them. She could not feel her feet for the first few beats. "You needn't have done this," she said, looking at his shoulder because she could not bear the faces around them. "Yes," he said. "I did." His hand at her back was light, formal, careful. He guided her through the turns with the ease of a man who had been trained before he was old enough to hate it. Eleanor kept waiting for him to say something kind and dreadful, something that would turn his act into pity, but he said nothing. That silence saved her more than any speech could have done. After a few moments, she found her breath. "You have caused trouble for my family," she said quietly. His eyes met hers then. "Did I? You did not ask my sisters. No, they will not forgive that. I did not seek their pardon. The answer should have sounded cruel. It did not. It sounded weary, as if he had long since stopped shaping himself to please rooms like this one. She made the mistake of looking past him. Rose stood near the edge of the floor, still and proud, her face set like glass. Lydia tried to laugh with the young men beside her, but her fingers were clenched around her fan. Eleanor felt guilt strike her through the embarrassment. That was the worst part. Even now, even in her pain, she did not want to be the stone that sank her sisters. "Your Grace," she said, "you have made a lesson of us all." Something changed in his face, not anger, something older. "No," he said softly. "A lesson was being made before I stepped in." The music carried them on. Once their hands brushed in the turn, and Eleanor felt a strange, quick heat rise under her skin. He did not smile. He did not flirt. He did not ask if she liked the season or the weather or the city, yet for the length of that dance, she did not feel invisible. The room, which had always been a place where she disappeared, had been forced to see her standing in the very middle of it. When the last note fell, he bowed. "Thank you, Miss Hart." She should have said something polished. Instead, she said, "Why me?" He looked at her for one still moment. "Because it was you." Then he turned away. He danced no more that night. Not with Rose, not with Lydia. Not with any of the girls whose mothers watched him like players watch a card table. He spoke to old men, bowed to widows, stood beside his aunt for a set, and vanished before midnight. By then, the whole room had built 10 stories from one dance. In the carriage home, no one spoke at first. Rain beat the roof. The wheels hissed through mud. Then Mrs. Hart said, "You must remember every word." "There were hardly any," Eleanor answered. Rose stared out the window. "He meant to shame us." Lydia turned on her. "You cannot know that. I know enough. Perhaps he liked her." Lydia shot back, though the words came thin and strange, as if she did not know whether she was defending Eleanor or punishing Rose. Rose laughed once. It broke in the middle. Men like him do not look at girls like Eleanor. Eleanor sat very still. That hurt more than the laugh at the table, not because Rose meant to cut deep, but because Rose spoke from the same cruel map the world had pressed into all of them. Beauty first, you second. The rest hardly counted. At home, Eleanor undressed in the cold of her room and found that one glove was missing. She searched the bed, the cloak, the carriage blanket. Nothing. The grey silk had vanished somewhere between the ballroom and the wet drive home. She sat on the edge of the bed with the one glove left in her hand and remembered the Duke's eyes falling to the torn seam, not with mockery, not even with pity, but with something like recognition that troubled her more than if he had been merely kind. At Blackthorn Hall, Henry found the lost glove himself. It lay near the doors that opened to the terrace, a little twist of grey against polished floor. He bent and picked it up before any servant could. The seam was open where it had split. The stitches were small and patient. He stood with the glove in his hand while music moved on in the room behind him, and for one unguarded second he was 12 years old again, standing outside his mother's chamber and seeing her fold away a pair of gloves after a supper where a countess had smiled too brightly and said, "Country girls do learn, in time." His mother had smiled back then. She had been so good at smiling back. She had taught him that quiet could hold pride. His father had taught him that quiet could also be crushed. Years later, Henry still hated ballrooms because they turned harm into sport, and called it grace. He had not crossed that floor for romance. He knew that. He had crossed it because the sound of women laughing at a torn glove had reached some old wound he had never managed to bury. But when Eleanor Hart lifted her chin and said, "My glove is torn," he had seen more than injury. He had seen refusal. She had still held herself as if she belonged to her own bones, even with half the room watching her fall apart. His aunt, Lady Agnes, found him in the morning room before dawn with the glove on the table, beside untouched tea. "You brought back a token?" she asked. He gave her a look. She came closer, saw the grey silk, and said nothing for a moment. Agnes had loved his mother. She understood more than most people without being told. "Will you return it?" she asked. "Yes. Will you also return for the girl?" "That is not your concern." Agnes stirred sugar into her cup. "No, it is only your life." Henry said nothing, but later that morning he asked his steward for the heart accounts. 3 days after the ball he rode to Hart House under a sky the colour of tin. He could have sent the glove by servant. He knew that. He told himself he had come because the late Mr. Hart's loan papers needed settling before spring. It was not wholly false. The papers did need settling, but he could have signed them from his desk. A maid led him to the study where Eleanor stood at the window with a stack of ledgers in her arms. She had no silk on now. She wore brown wool, plain and warm, with no ornament except the loose strand of hair at her neck where the pins had failed. For one brief and unhelpful moment, he thought she looked more herself than she had under all that light. She turned, saw him, and nearly dropped the ledgers. "Your Grace," he bowed. "Miss Hart." Her eyes flicked to the glove in his hand. A touch of colour came into her face. "I did not know where I lost it." "I did." He crossed the room and set it on the desk. Her fingers hovered over it, but did not take it yet. "Thank you," she said. "You need not have ridden out for this. There were other matters." She gave a short nod toward the papers. "The debts. Yes, well," she said, drawing in a breath. "I am glad you came to me, then. My mother dislikes figures, and my sisters dislike them even more." The answer surprised him. It was not flirtation. It was fact. Yet the last line held the driest edge of humour. He looked at the open books. "You manage the estate, as much of it as can still be called an estate." He stepped nearer. She smelled faintly of tea and paper, and the cold air that slipped through old window frames. "Your father borrowed against the North Field." "I know. He also delayed rent on 2 tenant cottages." "I know that as well." "You know a good deal." Her mouth moved, not quite a smile. No one else wished to. He had met women who knew how to flatter a powerful man within 3 breaths. Eleanor Hart had just admitted, with no fear and no appeal, that the room he stood in had been left to her because it bored everyone prettier. Something in him eased. They sat across from one another at the desk and spoke for an hour about numbers, about roofs, about a bridge on the East Lane that would not last another hard rain. Her voice was soft, but there was iron in the way she used it. She did not ask for mercy. She did not try to soften the truth. When he said the loan terms had been foolish, she nodded and said, "My father was dying. Men make poor bargains with time when they hear it breathing behind them." Henry looked up then. She had said it without tears, not coldly, not to wound, only because life had taught her to name things cleanly. He wondered how many losses had hardened into that plain courage. When he rose to leave, he said, "The cottages will wait until summer." She stiffened at once. "Your Grace, I do not ask for charity. It is not charity. Winter is a poor season for repairs. That is not the same thing." "No," he said, "it is not." She held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded. It was the first time he saw how tired she was. Not weak, tired in the deep way of people who carry weight before they are asked if they can. As he reached the door, she said, "Why did you ask me to dance?" He had known the question would come. Still his back tightened. "Because they were hurting you," he answered. He heard the mistake in his own words as soon as they were spoken. Her face changed. It did not break, it closed. "I see," she said. "That is not all, but it is first." He could think of nothing to say that did not sound worse, and he had spent most of his life failing when warmth was required quickly. So he only bowed and left, carrying with him the clear knowledge that he had wounded her more honestly than any cruel man could have done with a lie. Winter went on. The rain turned to frost. Smoke hung low over the fields. And yet Henry kept finding reasons to return. He came once with papers for the bridge, once to speak with the steward about the north wall, and discovered Eleanor already there, skirts muddied, measuring the broken stones herself. Once because Rose had written, in a hand too elegant to be sincere, asking if the Duke might advise on the orchard lease. Henry almost turned back after reading the note, then rode on anyway because he knew Rose had not written it alone. She would never have thought to mention the trees. Eleanor had. At Hart House he was usually received first by Mrs. Hart, who smiled now with a bright, trembling hope that made Henry uneasy. He knew that look. It was the look of someone counting rescue before it had been offered. Rose became careful around him. Lydia became louder. Only Eleanor remained the same, though a kind of watchfulness grew in her, as if she was waiting for him to become the man she had first feared he was. Sometimes, when others left the room, that watchfulness eased. One afternoon he found her in the small back parlor, mending the torn grey glove by the fire. Rain slid down the windows. A clock ticked on the mantel. "You intend to save it again," he said. She looked up. "It has served longer than most things in this house. I owe it loyalty." He stood near the fire, not too near. "You owe old cloth nothing." "No," she said, lowering her eyes to the stitch. "But I know what it is to be kept only while one is useful." The words were quiet. They struck him harder than anger would have done. He could not answer at once. After a moment he said, "If your family has made you feel so." She cut the thread with small scissors and met his gaze. "Do not pity me again, Your Grace." It should have put distance between them. Instead it made something warm and sharp move through him. "Very well," he said. She held up the glove. "Good. Then tell me if the seam is straight." He took the glove from her. Their fingers brushed. The touch was nothing and far too much. He looked at the neat new line of thread. "It is exact. That is the best sort of praise I am ever likely to earn from you." His mouth almost smiled. "Do you seek more?" "No." Her eyes flickered to his face. "I only wished to see if you were able. That did it." He did smile then, though only a little. Eleanor stared as if a locked door had opened half an inch and bright light had slipped through. After that day, the ground between them changed. He learned that she drank tea too hot and never waited for it to cool. He learned that she played the piano when the house slept because music in daylight felt to her like a kind of waste. He learned that she kept lists tucked into her sleeves: flour, lamp oil, soap, nails. He learned that she loved the orchard even though half the trees had gone wild. Once she showed him a row of old pear trees behind the south wall. Their branches were black against the white sky. "My father planted those when Rose was born," she said. "Mother thought it foolish." He said, "Trees were slower than suns, but kinder." Henry looked at her profile and thought of all the strange, small truths by which a person is really known. She learned things too, that he never turned his back to the center of a crowded room if he could help it, that he disliked loud praise more than open dislike, that he remembered every servant's name, that he rode out after storms to see damage with his own eyes instead of trusting reports, that he went once a month to the village school because his mother had founded it, though he never spoke of her unless forced. The first time he did speak of her came by accident. They were in the schoolroom after dark. Snow had begun to fall. The teacher had gone to fetch a lamp, leaving them among slates and small wooden desks. Eleanor picked up a child's copybook and smiled at the shaky letters inside. "Your mother must have been very patient," she said. Henry looked at the black window. She had to be. With children, with everyone, it was more than he meant to say. Eleanor did not press him, she only waited. The quiet she offered was different from other people's quiet. It did not demand, it made room. "They laughed at her once," he said at last. "Not unlike that night." Eleanor's fingers tightened on the copybook. "She was not born to rank. My father's circle never let her forget it." She smiled through most things. In time, she forgot how not to. The lamp flame shivered as the teacher returned. Henry said no more, but the look in Eleanor's eyes followed him all the way home. At Hart House, pain moved in new shapes. Rose had always lived as if beauty were both weapon and duty. Now that duty had turned sour in her hands, more than one young man had asked after Eleanor since the ball. Not because they cared for her, but because the Duke's notice had made her suddenly visible. Rose saw it. It humiliated her in a way she did not know how to confess. One evening, while Eleanor trimmed lamp wicks in the drawing room, Rose burst out. "You think I laughed because I hate you?" Eleanor set down the small silver scissors. "Did you not?" Rose's face flushed. "No, I laughed because they were looking at me too." The answer hung between them, ugly in its truth. "I have spent my life," Rose said, voice shaking, "knowing that if I stop shining for 1 hour, all of this ends. Mother taught me that. Every supper, every visit, every season. Smile, Rose. Sit straight, Rose. Do not let them see fear." And then for 1 second at that table I was afraid they would turn on me, and I laughed before they could. Eleanor said nothing. Rose's eyes filled but did not spill. "I know what that makes me." "It makes you frightened," Eleanor said at last. "It does not make it kind, no. No." Eleanor repeated. Softer now, it was not pardon, but it was the first plank laid over the broken ground between them. Lydia's truth came less neatly. She entered Eleanor's room one night with her hair half unpinned and threw herself into the chair by the fire. "Mr. Bell says I am too lively to be trusted," she declared. Eleanor looked up from folding linen. "I am sorry. No, you are not. You warned me I laughed too easily at foolish men. I did not warn. I merely thought it." Lydia snorted, then covered her face with both hands. "If I do not laugh, no one notices me after Rose enters. If I do laugh, they say I am light. There is no right shape for a girl, Ellie. Only better and worse cages." Eleanor stared at her sister for a long moment, then crossed the room and laid the folded linen down. "No," she said, "there is not." They sat in silence after that, with the fire breathing red light over the boards. And for the first time in many years, Eleanor felt not only wounded by her sisters, but bound to them by the same trap, only painted in different colors. Still, the house pressed on her. Their mother grew brighter whenever Henry called, and grimmer whenever a week passed without him. "You must not meet him in that old brown dress," Mrs. Hart said one morning. "And do not speak of roofs or rents unless he asks. Men like to feel useful, not instructed." Eleanor folded a letter and set it aside. If he dislikes knowing the truth of this house, he should not enter it. Her mother stared. "Do you want to save us or not?" The question landed hard because it was not only about money. Eleanor rose. "I will not be laid out like goods on a market cloth." Mrs. Hart's face sharpened with fear. Easy words from the one who has never had to wager beauty. Something fierce and old lifted in Eleanor then. "No," she said, very steady. "Only labor, only silence. Only all the work done so, the rest of you might still be called graceful." Her mother went white. The room held only the hiss of the fire. Eleanor had not meant to speak so plainly, yet once said, the truth stood between them like a door finally opened. She saw pain flash through her mother's face, but also shame. Not because the words were false, because they were not. That same week, Lady Agnes sent invitations for a musicale at Blackthorn Hall. Mrs. Hart could hardly sit still with hope. Rose agreed to go, because not going would look like defeat. Lydia agreed because she always ran toward any room that promised noise. Eleanor wanted to refuse. But Rose came to her bedchamber with a blue ribbon in her hand and said quietly, "If you do not come, Mother will only think we are all ruined. And I am tired, Ellie. I would rather suffer the music than her face." So Eleanor went. Blackthorn Hall was softer by candle than by the blaze of a ball. Fewer people. Lower music. The rooms held whispers instead of bright attacks. Henry spoke with guests near the piano. When Eleanor entered, his gaze found her almost at once, not because she was the prettiest girl in the room, not because she shone the hardest, simply because he had begun, against all judgment, to look for her. That knowledge warmed and frightened her in equal measure. She wore the grey gloves again. During the second song, she slipped from the music room to the terrace hall for air. The doors were shut against the cold, but the glass was thin and rain tapped it like fingertips. She stood with her hand on the latch, breathing the faint scent of wet stone from outside. Voices rose from the next room. She knew at once one of them was Lady Agnes. "He is like his mother in the worst way," Agnes said sadly. "One hurt and he tries to mend every hurt he sees, though he calls it duty. That poor girl touched some old grief in him the night of the ball." Eleanor stood as still as the marble bust beside her. Another woman answered, "Then he does not care for her." Agnes sighed. "I did not say that. I only mean he began in the wrong place, the wrong place." Eleanor's hand slipped from the latch. She did not wait to hear more. The room seemed suddenly smaller than a glove closed too tightly around the hand. So it had been pity first, memory first. Some ghost of his mother standing between them. The tenderness she had begun to fear, then want, then half believe in, turned thin and cold inside her. When Henry found her, she was in the long gallery, moving toward the stairs. "You are leaving early." She did not stop. "Yes." He came beside her. "Why?" She turned then, too full to stay quiet. "Because I am tired of being chosen for the shape of my pain." He stared at her. "What does that mean?" "It means I am not a wound for you to dress because an older wound once bled in your house." Color left his face. For a moment she almost hated herself for striking true, but the hurt in her had finally found a mouth. "I was laughed at," she said, voice low and shaking. "You stepped in. I was grateful. Then you came to our home. You listened. You looked at me as if I mattered. And now I learn that perhaps I never did. Only what was done to me mattered, only what it reminded you of. That is not all. Is it not?" He opened his mouth, then shut it again. That terrible clipped silence of his returned at the worst moment, like a servant more loyal to habit than to need. Eleanor drew back. "You see?" she whispered. "When it is time to name me, you cannot." He looked as if she had struck him across the mouth. She wanted him to deny it, wanted him for once to stop being careful and be clear. But Henry Ashcombe had spent a lifetime locking feeling behind duty. He was a man who knew how to protect, how to provide, how to stand between harm and the harmed. He did not know how to say "I see you" and mean all that it asked of him. "I will not be pitied into a future," she said. "Not even a fine one." Then she went down the stairs and did not look back. After that, the silence between Blackthorn Hall and Hart House grew so wide that even gossip lost the will to cross it. Henry did not call. Eleanor told herself that was best. Still, each morning brought a small, sharp letdown she hated. She worked harder to crush it. She sorted accounts. She wrote to a distant aunt in York who needed a companion, and had once said Eleanor would be welcome if ever she wished for change. She began to make plans, not because her heart was broken. She would not give the moment such a pretty name. No, her heart felt more bruised than broken, as if something had finally reached for it and then drawn back, leaving it sore in the place where hope had briefly rested. One evening, Mrs. Hart found the half-written letter. "You mean to leave?" Eleanor folded the page. "Perhaps, and abandon us." The old guilt rose at once, practiced as prayer, yet this time it met something steadier. "I am not your plank over every dark water," Eleanor said. Her mother sat down heavily by the fire. In the dim light, she looked suddenly older, the lines around her mouth no longer sharp with command, but worn with use. "When your father died," she said, staring at her own hands, "I looked at the three of you and thought I must save what I could. Rose had beauty, Lydia had charm, you had sense. I put each thing where I believed it would feed us. I did not see that I was cutting you apart while I sorted you." Eleanor stood very still. "I was afraid," her mother whispered. "Every day. It is an ugly sort of fear. It makes bargains before the soul can protest." For the first time in years, Eleanor crossed the room and knelt before her mother's chair. "I know you were afraid," she said. Mrs. Hart touched her hair with trembling fingers. "Will you still go?" "Yes," Eleanor answered after a pause. "If I stay only because I am needed, I will begin to hate all of you. I do not want that to be what is left of me." Her mother closed her eyes. "Then go before hate settles. It is harder to sweep out than dust." It was more blessing than Eleanor had expected. She bent her head into her mother's lap for one quiet breath and felt, under the thin skin and old silk, the ghost of a gentler woman still alive. The village spring assembly was held the night before Eleanor meant to leave. She did not wish to attend. But Rose, now humbled enough to plead plainly, came to her door and said, "Please, come once more. If you leave tomorrow, let us have one evening that is not all endings." So Eleanor went, not in satin, not in hope, but in a simple cream gown with the grey gloves folded in her reticule. She did not put them on. She could not bear them that night. The assembly room was smaller than Blackthorn's ballroom, with lower ceilings and too many candles set near the walls. The air smelled of wax, damp cloaks, and spring mud brought in on boots. Fiddles tuned in the corner. Country neighbors spoke a little too loudly, trying to sound grand. It should have felt easier than the Duke's great rooms. Instead, Eleanor's chest was tight from the start. She danced once with a curate's nephew, and once with an old family friend. Rose danced with a lawyer from town whose kindness seemed real. Lydia laughed, but less wildly now, as if she had learned that noise could not save every tender thing. Mrs. Hart sat with other mothers, and watched her daughters with an expression Eleanor could not yet read without pain. Then a hush moved near the door. Eleanor knew before she turned. Henry had come. He wore dark blue this time, not black, and rain shone on his shoulders where the night had touched him. He did not speak to the room first. He did not bow to the local ladies or greet the vicar. His gaze found Eleanor at once, standing beside a pillar with one hand resting against the cool painted wood. Something in his face made her pulse stumble. He looked as if he had ridden hard and argued harder with himself the whole way. Rose saw him too. She touched Eleanor's arm once, almost in apology, then stepped back. Henry crossed the room. "Miss Hart," he said, "Your Grace. I asked at your house. They said you were here. I am, I know." Even now, when his heart was clearly beating close under the plain cut of his coat, he spoke as if words had edges he must not touch too fast. Eleanor almost smiled through the hurt. "If you have come to discuss roads or rents," she said, "tomorrow would be wiser. I leave in the morning." His whole body stilled. "Leave?" "For York. For how long? I do not know." The music began behind them, but neither moved. "I must speak with you," he said. "You have had many chances." "Yes," he answered, and for the first time she heard shame in the flatness of his tone. "I wasted them." He glanced toward the small side hall. After a long second, Eleanor nodded and walked there with him. The sounds of the dance softened behind the half-closed door. Only the tick of a tall clock and the soft hit of rain at the window kept them company. Henry reached into his coat and drew out two things. The first was her grey glove. The second was another glove, older, cream with age, the wrist lined in faded blue silk. "My mother's," he said. Eleanor looked from one to the other. "I kept yours," he went on, "because when I saw it on that floor, I remembered hers. That is true. When I asked you to dance, it was not because I had already learned you. It was because I could not stand there and watch that room do to you what another room once did to her." Eleanor held herself still. Every part of her wanted to flinch, yet she listened. "I began in the wrong place," he said. "My aunt was right and you were right. I saw hurt before I saw you. but that has not been true for a long time now. His fingers tightened around the gloves. I see you in your father's study with ink on your hand and no one to help you. I see you in the orchard, naming dead branches as if loss should be spoken cleanly. I see you standing against your mother's fear without turning cruel yourself. I see the way children come to you before they come to anyone else. I see how you mend what tears, even when it cuts your fingers. I see how hard you work not to ask for what you deserve, and He stopped. His breath caught once, small and human and unlike him. Eleanor's heart beat so hard she could feel it in her throat. "And I have come to love you," he said. The words were simple, not adorned, not perfect. For Henry, who had hidden behind duty all his life, they felt almost bare. She looked at him and saw not a rescuer, not a duke, not the cold figure half the county feared or wanted. She saw a man taught too young that tenderness could be mocked, then punished, then buried. A man who had learned to stand between harm and others, because he did not trust himself to stand open before love. A man who had finally come anyway. "Why did you never ask my sisters to dance?" she asked softly. He glanced toward the ballroom where laughter drifted faintly through the door. "Because they did not need me to choose them to prove they were seen. The room had already chosen them 100 times. You were the only one in it who was being erased." The answer hurt and healed at once. "They are not monsters," Eleanor said. "No," he replied, "only frightened in ways that wear prettier ribbons." She let out the breath she had been holding. He stepped nearer. "If you cannot forgive the poor beginning, I will bear it. But do not leave thinking that the thing between us is pity. Pity is quick. It burns bright and dies. This has followed me through rain, through ledgers, through silence, through every room where you were not." Eleanor felt tears gather, though she had promised herself none. "You should have said it sooner. I know. That is not a small wrong. No." His voice was low now. "It is not." She looked at the glove in his hand, her glove worn and mended twice. The seam was stronger now than before. Someone had stitched it with care. "You repaired it." He nodded. "Badly. My housekeeper redid most of it." A laugh escaped her then, small, wet, helpless. It changed his face more than any grand speech could have done. He lifted the grey glove. "May I?" Her hand shook as she offered it. But before he drew the glove on, he paused and looked at her bare fingers. "No," he said quietly, almost to himself. Then he set the glove aside and took her hand without silk between them. The touch was warm, steady, real. "I should like," he said, "if you will allow it, not merely one dance given in anger at cruelty, but every dance you can bear from a man still learning how to speak before the moment is gone." For a second she could not answer. Not because she did not know, because she did. She had known from the day he smiled by the fire over a repaired seam. She had known in the schoolroom, in the orchard, in every silence that asked more than words, and every wound that words then failed. She had hoped against her own judgment. Now that hope stood before her, soaked from rain, imperfect and late and true. "You are very poor at pretty speeches," she whispered. His mouth moved. "Yes, it is a pity, so I am told." She laughed again. The sound trembled. Then she drew one breath and said, "I do not need pretty. I need plain truth, spoken on time, and more than once if the first attempt fails." His eyes warmed with something that looked almost like wonder. "That I can try to give. Then try." He bowed his head once, as if accepting not only her hand but the labor of deserving it. From the ballroom came the opening strains of a new set. Henry glanced toward the door and then back to her. "Miss Hart," he said, and this time there was no rescue in it, no defense, no old ghost standing between them, only choice. "Will you dance with me?" "Yes," Eleanor answered. When they returned to the floor, people turned to look. Of course they did. Rooms like that always looked. But this time the looking did not touch her the same way. Rose saw her first, and with a strange brave little lift of her chin, smiled. Lydia grinned outright, then wiped at one eye as if dust had flown into it. Mrs. Hart pressed her hand to her mouth, not because a duke had crossed the room, though perhaps that too, because her quiet daughter, the one she had sorted into usefulness and nearly lost there, was walking toward the center without shrinking. Henry led Eleanor into the dance. He did not hold her as if she might break. He held her as if she were a woman he had chosen with open eyes. Once, during the turn, she saw Rose accept a hand from the lawyer with the kind face. Lydia was already laughing with the curate's nephew, but this time the laughter was lower, less desperate, almost her own. The room had not changed. People were still vain, frightened, foolish, hungry. But for one moment, the old order had loosened. After the dance, Henry did not let go at once. "Will you still leave tomorrow?" he asked. "Yes," Eleanor said. His hand tightened, then eased. "To York?" She shook her head. "No. To Blackthorn, if your aunt will have me for a guest long enough for us to begin properly." For the first time since she had known him, Henry looked openly, helplessly glad. "My aunt," he said, "will behave as if she arranged the whole thing from birth. I thought as much. And after that?" Eleanor lifted one shoulder. "After that, we may see if a duke and a girl with a mended glove can build something stronger than a ballroom rumor." He bent his head closer. "We will." Spring came slowly over the county. The orchard put out shy white bloom. The bridge on the East Lane was repaired. The north cottages were roofed before the last cold left the mornings. Eleanor spent 6 weeks at Blackthorn Hall under Lady Agnes's watchful joy. And during those weeks, Henry learned to speak sooner, while Eleanor learned that love from a careful man often arrived not in a flood but in a steady stream. A chair brought near the fire before she asked. A book left open to a poem her father had once quoted, a pause in the doorway just to hear her playing piano when he thought she did not know he stood there. Mrs. Hart came to visit and cried only once, in private, from the shock of seeing her daughter welcomed in rooms she had once feared would devour her. Rose became engaged by autumn, not to rank but to a good man who admired that she had finally learned how not to laugh with wolves. Lydia did not marry that year. To everyone's surprise, she said she would rather wait than sparkle herself into a cage. Mrs. Hart almost argued, then only sighed and said, perhaps one stubborn daughter in the family had taught the rest too much. Henry proposed in the orchard at Hart House, where the old pear trees stood in late sun, and the ground smelled of grass and warm earth. He did not kneel in mud because Eleanor told him she would never have him ruin a good coat for a custom. Instead, he placed the grey glove, carefully folded, in her palm. "I thought," he said, not quite smiling, "that we might keep this, to remind us how poorly we began." "And how well we repaired it?" she asked. His eyes held hers. "If you think we have," she slid her bare hand into his, "we are still stitching." "That will do," he said. It did more than do. It was enough, not a perfect ending, because people are not cured in a season, and old wounds do not vanish because music swells at the right moment. But it was enough that he had learned to ask for love instead of hiding behind duty, and enough that she had learned being chosen did not mean being used, not when the choosing came with truth. When they walked back toward the house, her mother watched from the window. Rose waved a handkerchief as if she were signaling a ship to shore. Lydia ran down the steps with no grace at all, and Henry, who had once stepped onto a ballroom floor only to stop one cruelty, found he no longer feared the room where his life had turned. If Eleanor's quiet courage stayed with you, leave a like and tell me this. Should a heart forgive a poor beginning when the love that follows is honest and hard-won? And if this story moved you, subscribe, so the women who are overlooked in bright rooms may still be seen when it matters most.